a fierce encounter in the shadows. The streets were eerily quiet as a storm rolled in over the city. The once bustling alleyways, now soaked with rain, seemed to whisper secrets of despair and neglect. Among the shadows, a lone figure moved, its powerful frame casting a fleeting silhouette against the dim light of a flickering street lamp. Bruno, a pit bull with a muscular build and scars etched deep into his body, limped through the narrow lane, his head low and his ribs protruding from hunger. Bruno was no stranger to pain. Bred and trained to fight, he had once been the prized possession of a ruthless man who cared only for the money Bruno could earn in underground dogfights. But the moment Bruno lost his last fight, he became worthless. Discarded like trash, he was left to fend for himself on the unforgiving streets. Now, each step he took was a battle against exhaustion, his stomach growling with an ache that had become all too familiar. The rain pelted his scarred coat, washing away the grime but doing nothing to soothe his hunger or pain. Bruno sniffed at discarded bags and overturned trash bins, searching for even the smallest morsel of food. But the city offered him no solace. Every sound, distant sirens, the rustling of garbage, or the occasional squeak of a rat seemed amplified in the empty alley. As he trudged forward, his ears suddenly perked up. Through the sound of the rain and distant thunder, he heard something unusual. A faint, high-pitched wail. It wasn't the sharp yip of another stray dog or the mewl of a cat. This sound was softer, more human. Curious but wary, Bruno followed the noise, his nose twitching as he caught an unfamiliar scent. Something warm, alive. Bruno felt that he'd listened harder than he'd listened before. His journey led him deeper into the alley, past broken bottles and piles of forgotten waste, until he reached a corner where the sound grew louder. There, tucked against the wall near an overflowing dumpster, was a small bundle wrapped in a tattered, soaked blanket. The cries came from within, muffled but insistent. Bruno approached cautiously, his powerful frame moving with an almost unnatural gentleness. His nose nudged the edge of the blanket, and as it shifted slightly, a tiny hand emerged, followed by a trembling face. It was a baby, its cheeks red from the cold, its small body shivering as it cried out in desperation. Bruno froze, his amber eyes locked onto the infant. For a moment, he didn't know what to do. His instincts, honed by years of survival and fighting, urged him to keep moving, to focus on his own needs. But something deeper stirred within him, something he hadn't felt in years, if ever. The baby's cries softened as its eyes met Bruno's. In that moment, a strange connection formed between them, a silent understanding that transcended the barriers of species and circumstance. Bruno lowered his massive head, sniffing the child carefully. The baby's cries softened as it gazed guiltily at Bruno's. In that moment, a strange cry softened, allowed the babies to cry on for years and circumstance. Bruno lowered his massive fingers, reached out, and gripped the baby's head. Awaiting help. Awaiting help. Despite the gnawing hunger in his belly and the relentless rain soaking through his fur, Bruno lay down beside the baby, curling his body protectively around the fragile form. The rough asphalt scraped against his wounds, but he didn't move. His muscular frame acted as a shield, keeping the infant warm and dry. The hours stretched on, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Bruno's ears twitched at every sound, his sharp senses alert for any threat. He knew the dangers that lurked in the city: packs of stray dogs, opportunistic predators, and even humans who wouldn't hesitate to harm either of them. Yet he stayed vigilant, his growls low and warning, ready to defend the baby at all costs. As the rain finally began to ease, Bruno lifted his head, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. He knew the baby wouldn't survive long in the cold, exposed alley. The child needed warmth, food, and care, things Bruno couldn't provide, but he could take the baby somewhere safe. With careful movements, Bruno nudged the bundle once more, ensuring the baby was securely wrapped. Then, gripping the edge of the blanket in his jaws, he lifted the child as delicately as he could. It was a strange sight, a fierce, battle-scarred dog carrying an infant through the empty streets. The city began to stir as dawn broke, casting a pale light over the drenched buildings. Bruno avoided the busier streets, sticking to the shadows where he wouldn't be noticed. Yet, his presence didn't go completely unnoticed. A few early risers caught sight of him, their reactions a mix of fear and confusion. "Get away, you filthy mutt," one man shouted, throwing a rock that narrowly missed Bruno's side. But Bruno didn't stop. He pressed on, his determination overriding his exhaustion. Each step was a struggle, but the soft, steady breathing of the baby gave him strength. Finally, he reached a park on the edge of the city. The air here was calmer, the chaos of the urban sprawl giving way to patches of green and the faint chirping of birds. Bruno spotted a woman sitting alone on a bench, her head bent as she scrolled through her phone. She looked different from the others he had encountered, less harsh, more approachable. With the last of his strength, Bruno approached her, laying the bundle gently at her feet before collapsing onto the wet grass. His sides heaved with effort, his once proud frame now a picture of exhaustion. The woman, Clara, looked down, startled by the sight of a massive dog so close. Her first instinct was to recoil, but then she noticed the bundle. She gasped as she pulled back the blanket, revealing the baby's pale, tear-streaked face. "Oh my God!" she whispered, her hands trembling as she picked up the infant. The baby let out a weak cry, but it was alive, and that was all that mattered. Clara's eyes shifted to Bruno, who lay motionless but alert, his amber gaze fixed on her. For a moment they stared at each other, an unspoken understanding passing between them. This wasn't just any stray. This dog had saved a life. The instinct awakens. Bruno's mind raced with conflicting instincts. He was a fighter, a creature molded by years of violent training and brutal battles. Yet as he stood over the baby, something deep within him stirred. A protective impulse he had never known. His senses screamed for him to flee, to seek out food, to ignore the fragile creature before him. But his heart, or whatever part of it still remained, told him to stay. The baby's cries pierced the air, but it wasn't just the sound that unsettled Bruno. It was the vulnerability in those cries, the weakness in the tiny being that struck him with an unfamiliar emotion. Bruno had never encountered something so small, so helpless. In his past life, the only thing that mattered was survival, and survival meant fighting to the death, no matter the odds. But now there was no fight, no aggression in the air, just the raw, pure need for protection. His strong, battle-worn body ached, but he ignored the pain. It was nothing compared to the overwhelming sense of duty he felt in this moment. His tired eyes shifted from the baby's trembling form to the dark alley around them. The world beyond was hostile, unforgiving, but here, with the baby in his care, it was different. The rain continued to pour, cold and unrelenting, soaking Bruno's coat and causing the baby's cries to grow more desperate. The cold didn't seem to bother Bruno, though. His mind, once clouded by hunger and rage, had cleared. For the first time in what seemed like ages, he felt the stirrings of a purpose. This was no longer about him. It was about keeping the baby safe, about doing something that felt right, something good. Bruno's instincts had always been sharp, honed by years of survival on the streets and in the dogfighting pits. He had learned to trust his nose, his ears, his eyes, all the senses that kept him alive in a world that sought to destroy him. But this time, his instincts were different. He wasn't just protecting himself. There was something far more important now: the fragile life that lay before him. The baby's tiny fingers, slick with rainwater, reached out toward Bruno. There was no fear in the baby's movements, only an innocent curiosity. Bruno's heart, hardened by years of violence, softened. He lowered his head closer to the baby, sniffing its tiny form, taking in the scent of the soft skin and the faint warmth that still clung to the child despite the damp surroundings. The baby's crying had slowed, but it was still weak and strained. The cold, the hunger. It was all too much for such a young life to endure. Bruno's stomach growled in response, a reminder of the gnawing hunger that had plagued him for days. But that hunger felt insignificant now. There was something far more urgent that demanded his attention. He nudged the baby gently with his nose, as though offering comfort, as though telling the child that everything would be okay. But Bruno knew that everything wasn't okay. The baby needed help, food, warmth, and safety. He couldn't provide those things on his own. He could only protect, only keep watch, only guard the child until someone else could come. He thought back to the alley he had wandered through earlier, the places he'd passed where people had shooed him away with disdain and fear. Would anyone stop to help him now? Would anyone care about a starving dog and an abandoned child? His mind raced through the possibilities, but none of them seemed promising. Yet, still, he knew he couldn't leave the baby here. Even though he was weak, even though he could barely stand, he would fight for this child. Bruno had always been a fighter, but this fight wasn't for survival. This was for something pure, something he had never experienced, a chance to be a protector. The sky darkened further, the storm growing fiercer with each passing minute. But despite the overwhelming sense of desperation creeping into the air, Bruno stood his ground. The baby stirred in its blanket, and Bruno's gaze never left the small figure. In that moment, there was no past, no fight, no scars. There was only the instinct to protect, to fight for something good. With a low growl, Bruno stepped forward, careful not to jostle the baby. His eyes flickered around the alley, scanning for any signs of danger. The sounds of distant traffic, the occasional footsteps of someone walking by, made him uneasy. But there was no immediate threat, not yet. The harshest enemy in Bruno's life was hunger, but hunger didn't matter now. What mattered was the baby, and Bruno's protective instincts had fully awakened. He would fight for this child as fiercely as he had ever fought for survival. The fight ahead might be his most difficult one yet, but he was ready. Bruno would not fail. As the rain slowed, the streetlights above flickered, casting an eerie glow over the alley. Bruno stood tall, his posture one of unwavering vigilance. The small, helpless baby, once abandoned and forgotten, now had a protector, a guardian, in the form of the fiercest dog the streets had ever known. And with that, Bruno's instincts were set. He would guard the baby, no matter what it took, no matter what came next. The first threat. As Bruno stood watch over the baby, the sound of distant sirens and hurried footsteps echoed through the alley. It was still early morning, but the streets were far from quiet. The once silent, forgotten alley was suddenly teeming with life, and not all of it was good. Bruno's heightened senses picked up on the faint sounds of shuffling feet, the distinct smell of other stray dogs, and the rustling of garbage bags. A low growl escaped his throat as he stood over the baby, his posture tense. A pack of stray dogs had been drawn by the scent of the baby's cries. Hungry, wild, and with no concern for the life they would take, the pack advanced. Bruno's protective instincts flared, and he positioned himself firmly between the baby and the approaching danger. His muscles tensed, his body coiling like a spring ready to snap. "Hey!" The leader of the pack, a mangy, scarred dog with eyes filled with malice, bared its teeth, growling low and menacingly. Bruno could see the other dogs behind him, their hungry eyes scanning the scene. The baby's tiny body, wrapped in the filthy blanket, was now exposed. The pack knew it was a vulnerable target. Bruno took a step forward, his growl deepening. The pack leader lunged at him, its sharp teeth aimed at Bruno's throat. With a powerful move, Bruno sidestepped, grabbing the dog's throat in his jaws. He slammed the dog to the ground, his grip unrelenting. The other dogs hesitated for a moment, but hunger and instinct drove them forward. Bruno stood tall, his body bruised from past fights, but still strong enough to protect the child. His focus was entirely on the pack, his anger directed at them as they attempted to surround him. One by one, the dogs lunged, but Bruno was faster, stronger, and relentless. He fought with a ferocity he hadn't known in years, driven by the baby's fragile presence behind him. Every swipe of his paws, every bite he delivered, was a message: stay away. After what felt like an eternity, the pack began to retreat, their instincts finally recognizing that Bruno was not to be trifled with. The leader, still panting and wounded, glanced at the other dogs before they slowly slinked away into the shadows. Bruno stood firm, his body heaving with exhaustion, but his eyes never left the baby. He would not let anything take the child from him. A journey for help. As the pack disappeared into the distance, Bruno knew that he could not protect the baby here forever. The rain had stopped, but the danger was still present. He needed to find help, someone who could care for the baby, someone who could offer safety and warmth. Bruno's mind raced with options. The streets of the city had been kind to him, only in the sense that they had kept him alive, but they were far from a refuge for an infant. He sniffed the air again, the sharp scent of the city mixing with the faintest trace of human presence. It was a long shot, but he couldn't waste any more time. He nudged the baby gently, wrapping the blanket around the tiny form more securely, and began his search for help. With his usual alertness, Bruno moved cautiously through the streets. He passed by abandoned cars, old buildings, and street vendors who eyed him with disdain. His paws slapped against the wet concrete, but he didn't stop. The baby's slight, irregular breathing was all the mood he focused on, each tiny sound another reminder of his mission. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours. Bruno's hunger was still gnawing at him, but his heart burned with a different kind of urgency now. He couldn't let this child suffer any longer. He had to find help, and quickly. His eyes scanned the road and his heart skipped a beat when he saw a woman sitting alone on a park bench, her face buried in her phone. She was the first sign of hope Bruno had seen in what felt like forever. With a burst of energy, Bruno made his way towards her, his body moving in a way that only a determined protector could. Human kindness. Clara had been sitting on the bench for just a few minutes when she noticed movement at the edge of the park. At first, she thought it was just another stray dog, but something about the way it moved, slow, deliberate, purposeful, made her look closer. The dog was large, covered in scars, with a wild but exhausted look in its amber eyes. She was about to stand and walk away when the dog approached her, its gaze locking with hers. The dog did not growl. It didn't seem menacing despite its intimidating appearance. Instead, it did something strange. It carefully placed a small, soaked bundle at her feet. Clara jumped, startled, but instinctively bent down. She gasped when she saw the baby, barely a few months old, wrapped in a tattered blanket, its tiny face pale and drenched. Clara's heart stopped. Without thinking, she scooped the baby up, wrapping it in her coat to shield it from the chill of the morning air. She checked for any signs of injury, her hands trembling as she ran them over the infant's fragile body. The baby let out a weak cry, and Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What happened?" Her gaze turned to the dog, who was standing motionless, watching her intently. There was something in the way the dog looked at her, a mixture of exhaustion, loyalty, and something more, something almost human. For a moment, Clara felt as though the world around her had vanished, leaving only the baby and the dog. Her heart swelled with a sudden understanding. This dog had saved the baby, brought it to her when no one else would have. Clara carefully cradled the baby in her arms, glancing back at the dog. "Thank you," she whispered. She didn't know why she said it, but it felt right. The dog's tail wagged weakly, and with a final, tired gaze, it collapsed onto the ground, too exhausted to stand. Unlikely bonds. Clara held the baby in her arms, feeling the small warmth against her chest. The dog, its fur matted and its body worn from hunger and battle, lay on the ground in front of her, its amber eyes still focused on the baby. Clara couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude and awe for this strange protector. He had saved the child's life, and now, in return, he seemed to expect nothing more than safety and rest. She gently rocked the baby in her arms, her mind racing to figure out what to do next. The infant was so small, so fragile. Clara could see the faint signs of dehydration and malnutrition. She had no idea where the baby had come from or who had abandoned it, but there was no time to waste. Her instinct, her heart, told her that she needed to get the baby to safety and warmth. But her eyes kept drifting back to the dog. He had been through something terrible. She could see the bruises, the scrapes, the exhaustion in his face. He was hurt, tired, and hungry, yet he had put himself at risk to save this child. Clara's heart swelled with empathy. She couldn't leave him like this. Carefully, she reached into her bag, pulling out her phone. Her hands shook as she dialed the emergency services. "Yes, I've found an abandoned baby and a dog. They both need help," she explained urgently, her voice cracking. The operator assured her that help would arrive soon, but Clara wasn't sure if they could get here in time. The dog, despite its fierce and protective nature, was clearly in no condition to fight for the baby anymore. Clara looked at the dog, her brow furrowing in thought. "You saved her," she murmured softly, brushing her hand through his dirty fur. "You saved her, and now I'll save you." The dog, as if understanding her words, gave a small, tired wag of its tail before lowering its head to rest. Clara's heart broke at the sight, and she knew she couldn't leave him here to suffer, not after everything he had done for the baby. She would stay by his side until help arrived, but she needed to take action. She scooped up the baby with one arm, holding it close to her chest to provide warmth, while her other hand gently nudged the dog. "Come on," she coaxed softly. "Let's get you somewhere safe." With effort, Clara managed to get the dog to stand. He limped alongside her, though his movements were slow, deliberate, and clearly painful. He was fighting exhaustion, but Clara could tell that his protective instinct was still alive. He was doing this for the baby, for her. His unwavering loyalty left her speechless, and in that moment she felt a deep connection to this fierce, misunderstood creature. They reached Clara's car, and as she opened the door and carefully placed the baby in the back seat, the dog followed her, climbing in with surprising agility. His eyes never left the baby, and Clara noticed that despite his exhaustion, his protective nature remained fierce. A new beginning. At the animal clinic, the vet confirmed what Clara had feared. The dog, whom they now called Bruno, in honor of his strength and bravery, was suffering from malnutrition, exhaustion, and several untreated wounds. He was stable but needed urgent care. Clara's heart ached as she watched the veterinarian clean and dress his wounds, but she was grateful for the care he was receiving. The baby, on the other hand, was being treated with the same level of urgency. She was malnourished and dehydrated, but after a few hours of intravenous fluids and nourishment, the baby began to show signs of improvement. Clara sat beside her, watching the little one's tiny chest rise and fall with each breath, and she felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Bruno, despite his pain, lay nearby on a blanket, his eyes never straying far from the baby. Clara noticed the way he watched over the infant, as if he had taken on the role of a father, and she couldn't help but smile through her tears. This dog, this incredible protector, had risked everything to save the child. Once the vet gave them the all-clear, Clara gently cradled the baby and, with Bruno at her side, made her way home. It was the beginning of a new chapter for all of them. Bruno had found a place where he could rest, a place where he was no longer just a fighter, but a protector. And the baby, who Clara named Grace, had found a new family. Together, the three of them would build a life of love, safety, and healing. Over the next few weeks, Clara watched as Bruno's health slowly improved. His wounds healed, and the hunger that had once consumed him was replaced with something more: peace. His bond with Grace grew stronger with each passing day. Whenever Grace cried, Bruno was there, his strong presence offering her a sense of comfort and protection. Clara could see the deep connection between them, a connection forged by loyalty, love, and a shared hope for the future. One evening, as Clara sat on the porch with Grace in her lap and Bruno resting beside them, she realized that her life had changed forever. She had gone from a woman who had once felt lost and alone to someone who now had a family, albeit an unusual one. But it didn't matter. Bruno and Grace were her family now. She looked at them both, and in that moment, she knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. Bruno, the fierce, hungry, fighting dog who had found an abandoned baby, had given her the greatest gift of all, the chance to start over, the chance to love and be loved. And as the sunset cast a golden glow across the horizon, Clara smiled, knowing that this was only the beginning of a beautiful new chapter for them all. The final test. As time went on, Clara's bond with Bruno and Grace grew stronger. But the peace they had found together was soon to be tested. Bruno, once a stray, was no longer the same dog. He had become part of their family, and his instincts were no longer just about survival. They were about protecting those he loved. But as Grace grew, so did the danger that others would notice her, and with that came new challenges. Clara and Bruno would have to face their darkest test yet. Would their newfound family be able to survive the challenges that lay ahead? Would Bruno's fierce loyalty and protective instincts be enough to keep them safe, or would the world around them prove too dangerous? Only time would tell.